The trading post Crimson Harbor floated in the void like a rusted prayer to capitalism, which made it the perfect place for smuggler Captain Axel Torek to deliver the kind of news that would make his crew wish they had chosen safer occupations. Like juggling live plasma grenades, or dating Nexarian battle queens during mating season. "Run that by me again," First Officer Juno said, her tentacles twitching with the kind of nervous energy that preceded either combat or mass resignation letters. "You want us to transport a human passenger to the Forbidden Zones? The sectors where even the Galactic Patrol refuses to patrol because everything wants to kill you in ways that haven't been invented yet?" "That's the general idea," Axel replied, his forearms gesturing helplessly at the payment authorization that displayed more zeros than his crew had seen in their collective lifetimes. "Dr. Beth Hayes, wildlife behaviorist. She's paying triple hazard rates to get to Valdris Prime for what she calls critical field research." Engineer Cato snorted through his breathing apparatus, a sound like steam escaping from a broken reactor. "Critical field research, right. The last scientist who went to Valdris Prime came back as a collection of artistic bone fragments. The local wildlife there doesn't just hunt. It has hobbies involving creative taxidermy." "That's why she's paying so well," Communications Officer Vera added from her monitoring station, scrolling through planetary hazard reports with obvious fascination. "According to these files, Valdris Prime has achieved a perfect score in the absolutely do not visit unless you have a death wish category. Even the trading guilds have blacklisted it." The truth was, nobody in their right mind wanted anything to do with Valdris Prime. The planet existed in a state of perpetual biological warfare, where evolution had apparently decided that cooperation was for weaklings, and violence was an art form. The local ecosystem treated visitors like unwelcome party crashers, which was unfortunate because the visitors usually ended up becoming the entertainment. "The thing is," Navigation Officer Reed announced from his console, "our passenger specifically requested this ship because of our reputation for impossible deliveries." "Impossible deliveries," Juno repeated slowly. "She knows that our success rate with impossible deliveries is roughly 50-50, right? And the failures tend to be very permanent?" "I mentioned that in the preliminary negotiations." She seemed enthusiastic about the challenge. The crew exchanged glances that conveyed approximately 37 different variations of "humans are completely insane" in multiple alien languages. "Well," Axel said finally, "credits are credits. And frankly, we need the money more than we need our sanity." 3 days later, when the passenger transport shuttle docked with Crimson Harbor, Dr. Beth Hayes proved to be exactly what they had expected, a human who looked, like she had stepped out of an adventure novel and into real life, with absolutely no regard for the fundamental laws of self-preservation. She was average height for a human, with shoulder-length auburn hair that seemed perpetually windswept from excitement rather than actual wind, bright blue eyes that cataloged everything they saw with scientific curiosity, and clothes that looked practical enough to survive whatever she planned to encounter. She carried 2 large equipment cases and moved with the kind of confident energy that made experienced spacers reach for their emergency protocols. "Hello, everyone," she announced cheerfully as she stepped aboard. "I'm Beth Hayes, and I cannot wait to get started. This is going to be the adventure of a lifetime." "That's what we're afraid of," Juno muttered under her breath. "Dr. Hayes," Captain Axel said formally, "welcome aboard the Stellar Wanderer. I trust you've reviewed our safety protocols and emergency procedures?" "Oh yes, thoroughly. Though I have to say, I'm hoping we won't need them. I've studied the available data on Valdris Prime extensively, and I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about the local wildlife." Engineer Cato looked up from his environmental readings with obvious disbelief. "A misunderstanding?" "Dr. Hayes, the local wildlife has a documented 100% fatality rate for non-native visitors. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a statistic." "But that's exactly my point," Beth replied, her eyes lighting up with the kind of enthusiasm that made everyone else want to check their life insurance policies. "Everyone who's visited Valdris Prime has approached it as hostile territory. They've gone in armed, defensive, treating the local ecosystem as an enemy to be overcome. Because it keeps killing them," Communications Officer Vera pointed out helpfully. "But what if that's exactly the problem? What if the Valdrasani aren't naturally aggressive toward outsiders, but they're responding to perceived threats? The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for witnessing either miracles or complete mental breakdowns. Dr. Hayes, Navigation Officer Reed said carefully, "Are you suggesting that the reason every previous expedition has ended in creative dismemberment is because they weren't friendly enough?" That's a very simplistic way to put it, but essentially, yes. And your solution is to visit a planet full of apex predators and try to make friends with them. Exactly. The crew looked at each other with expressions that suggested they were collectively reconsidering their life choices, career paths, and possibly their entire understanding of reality. "Right," Captain Axel said eventually. "Well, you're paying the bills, so we'll get you there safely. But I want it clearly understood that our contract ends the moment you set foot on that planet. We are not responsible for whatever happens after that." "That's perfectly reasonable," Beth agreed. "Though I do hope you'll stick around long enough to document the breakthrough in interspecies relations." "The breakthrough in what now?" "Oh, I probably should have mentioned this earlier. I'm not just studying Valdrasani pack behavior. I'm planning to integrate with a pack structure, live among them, learn their social patterns, establish communication protocols." The sound that Engineer Cato made was probably intended to be words, but came out more like the noise a deflating balloon makes when it's giving up on life. "You want to live with them," First Officer Juno said slowly. "With the apex predators, who eat visitors. Who defend their territory from perceived threats," Beth corrected. "There's a significant difference. If I can approach them correctly, demonstrate that I'm not a threat, I believe they'll accept me as part of their social structure. And if you're wrong, then I'll become a very valuable data point for future researchers." The casual way she discussed her own potential death made everyone simultaneously impressed and concerned about human psychological development. As the Stellar Wanderer prepared for the hyperspace jump to Valdris Prime, Captain Axel couldn't shake the feeling that they were either about to witness the most remarkable breakthrough in xenobiological research or the most spectacular example of human overconfidence in galactic history. Knowing humans, it would probably be both. The journey to Valdris Prime took 6 standard days, during which Dr. Beth Hayes proved to be exactly the kind of passenger every cargo crew simultaneously loved and dreaded. She was enthusiastic about everything, asked intelligent questions about ship operations, helped with routine maintenance tasks, and generally made herself useful in ways that would have been delightful if not for the fact that she was planning to use her accumulated goodwill to convince them to drop her off on a planet that specialized in creative murder. "The fascinating thing about pack predators," she explained during one of the communal meals, "is that their aggression is almost always defensive in nature. They attack perceived threats to their territory, their resources, or their young. But if you can demonstrate that you're not a threat, many species will actually adopt outsiders into their social structure. Many species that aren't Valdrasani apex hunters," Communications Officer Vera pointed out. "Those things have been documented hunting for sport. Hunting behavior that looks like sport to us might actually be training exercises for their young, teaching them hunting techniques, pack coordination, resource management. It's quite sophisticated when you think about it." "I prefer not to think about it," Engineer Cato said firmly. "I find that contemplating the sophisticated hunting techniques of apex predators tends to interfere with my sleep patterns." "But that's exactly why this research is so important," Beth continued, completely oblivious to the fact that her enthusiasm was making everyone else nervous. "If we can understand their social structure, we might be able to establish peaceful contact with dozens of species that we currently classify as hostile. Or," First Officer Juno added pragmatically, "you might get eaten by creatures that are actually just as hostile as we thought, and we'll have learned that sometimes the obvious answer is the correct one. That's also a valuable data point." The fact that she could discuss her own potential dismemberment with the same cheerful enthusiasm she brought to equipment maintenance was either inspiring or deeply disturbing. Possibly both. On the 5th day of the journey, as they approached the Valdris system, the ship's sensors began picking up the automated warning beacons that surrounded the planet like an electronic constellation of doom. "Warning, Valdris Prime is classified as an extreme hazard zone," the mechanical voice announced with bureaucratic indifference. All unauthorized personnel are advised to maintain minimum safe distance. Planetary ecosystem contains multiple apex predator species with documented aggressive territorial behavior. Survival rate for surface contact, 0%. Galactic Authority assumes no responsibility for personnel who ignore this warning. 0%, Navigation Officer Reed repeated. Not even statistically insignificant or approaching zero. Just zero. Flat zero. That's because nobody's tried the right approach yet, Beth said confidently, checking her equipment for the 100th time. Everyone who's gone down there has been either military, corporate, or heavily armed research teams. No one's tried a peaceful, individual contact approach. There might be a reason for that, Captain Axel suggested diplomatically. Of course there is. Fear. Prejudice. The assumption that anything that looks dangerous must be hostile. But some of the most successful interspecies contacts in galactic history have come from individuals who were willing to set aside preconceptions and approach alien species with respect and openness. And some of the most spectacular failures have come from individuals who confused optimism with intelligent risk assessment, Juno added. True. But that's why I'm documenting everything. Even if this particular attempt doesn't succeed, the data will be invaluable for future contact efforts. As Valdris Prime grew larger in the viewports, the crew of the Stellar Wanderer found themselves torn between admiration for Dr. Hayes' courage and concern for her apparent inability to recognize when courage crossed the line into reckless endangerment. The planet itself was undeniably beautiful. Vast forests of silver-leafed trees covered most of the landmasses, broken by crystal-clear rivers and mountain ranges that caught the system's twin suns and threw rainbow reflections across the landscape. It looked like paradise, if paradise had been designed by someone with a degree in advanced predator management. Atmospheric readings are good, Engineer Cato reported. Breathable air, comfortable temperature, no obvious environmental hazards beyond the documented fauna. Fauna monitoring is showing significant activity, Communications Officer Vera added. I'm picking up movement signatures consistent with large pack animals throughout the forested regions. Looks like the local wildlife is active. Perfect, Beth said, shouldering her equipment pack. That means I won't have to spend time looking for them. Dr. Hayes, Captain Axel said one final time, I want to be absolutely clear about this. Once you're on that planet's surface, we cannot provide assistance. Our ship's weapons are inadequate for surface-to-surface support, and our landing capabilities are limited. If something goes wrong, you're on your own. I understand completely, and I appreciate your honesty, but I really do believe this is going to work. As the shuttle prepared for atmospheric entry, carrying Dr. Beth Hayes toward what was almost certainly either the greatest breakthrough or the most spectacular failure in xenobiological history, the crew of the Stellar Wanderer settled in to monitor what would either be a triumph of human ingenuity or a masterclass in why some warnings should be taken seriously. Knowing humans, it would probably be both. But as they watched the shuttle disappear into Valdris Prime's atmosphere, carrying its cheerfully optimistic cargo toward a meeting with apex predators that had never met a visitor they didn't eventually digest, one thing was certain. Whatever happened next, it would definitely be interesting. And in the cargo business, interesting was usually another word for expensive. 72 hours after Dr. Beth Hayes had disappeared into the silver forests of Valdris Prime, the crew of the Stellar Wanderer had developed a comprehensive betting pool. Not about whether she would survive her encounter with the local apex predators, but about how many pieces they would find her in when the inevitable search and rescue mission located her remains. I'm putting 50 credits on artistically arranged bone fragments, Engineer Cato announced during the morning briefing. The Valdrisani have a documented preference for symmetrical prey displays. 60 credits says they don't find anything at all, Communications Officer Vera replied, monitoring the silent comm channels with professional pessimism. Complete consumption is their usual method. Very efficient predators. Captain Axel tried to maintain some semblance of professional optimism, but even he had to admit the situation looked grim. It's only been 3 days. She might still be establishing initial contact. Or being slowly digested, First Officer Juno added helpfully. Valdrisani pack hunting strategies involve extended stalking periods before the actual feeding begins. What none of them knew was that Dr. Beth Hayes was currently experiencing the most extraordinary breakthrough in xenobiological research history. And it had absolutely nothing to do with establishing peaceful contact with apex predators. On the planet's surface, Beth sat cross-legged in a clearing surrounded by 12 of the most adorable, fluffy, and devastatingly dangerous creatures she had ever encountered. They weren't adult Valdrasani apex hunters. They were cubs. 6-month-old cubs who had apparently decided that this strange, hairless, bipedal visitor was the most fascinating thing they had ever seen. "Okay, this wasn't exactly what I planned," she murmured into her recording equipment, trying not to move too suddenly as one of the cubs attempted to investigate her equipment pack with obvious curiosity. "Initial contact has been established, but not with adult pack members as anticipated." The cubs were magnificent specimens, each one roughly the size of a large dog, covered in silver fur that shimmered with bioluminescent patterns, with oversized amber eyes that conveyed both intelligence and boundless curiosity. They moved with the fluid grace that marked their species as natural predators, but their behavior was entirely focused on play, exploration, and apparently, adopting Beth as their new favorite toy. "Note for the record," she continued, "Valdrasani cubs appear to lack the territorial aggression of adult pack members. They're exhibiting classic juvenile socialization behaviors, curiosity, play instincts, and what appears to be pack-bonding behavior toward non-threatening stimuli." One of the cubs, slightly braver than the others, had worked up the courage to sniff at Beth's boots. When she remained perfectly still, the cub made a soft chirping sound that might have been approval, and settled down against her leg with obvious contentment. "Extraordinary," Beth whispered. "They're treating me like a pack member. A very strange, very tall pack member, but definitely not prey." What she didn't realize was that her presence had created a significant problem for the adult Valdrasani pack. Because while the cubs had adopted her as their new favorite playmate, the parent hunters were faced with an unprecedented dilemma. How do you remove a potential threat from your territory when your offspring have decided it's their new best friend? From the tree line, 6 adult Valdrasani apex hunters watched the interaction with what could only be described as confused frustration. These were creatures perfectly designed for eliminating threats to their pack structure. They possessed natural weapons that could shred titanium, hunting instincts honed by millions of years of evolution, and pack coordination that made military units look like amateur theater groups. But their cubs loved the strange visitor. Alpha female 6 crouched behind a cluster of silverbark trees, her pack arranged in perfect hunting formation, watching their carefully planned ambush fall apart, because their offspring had apparently decided to stage an adoption intervention. "This has never happened before," her hunting partner Kex communicated through the subtle body language that served as their primary means of coordination. "Cubs are supposed to hide when strangers enter pack territory. Cubs are supposed to demonstrate proper threat assessment." 6 replied with a gesture that roughly translated to, "I am professionally embarrassed by our children's behavior. Should we intervene?" 6 studied the scene carefully. The human remained perfectly still, making no aggressive moves, no attempts to flee, and showing no signs of the fear response that typically triggered their prey drive. More importantly, the cubs were obviously content and unharmed. "We wait," she decided. "If the stranger threatens our young, we act immediately. Otherwise, we observe." This decision would prove to be the turning point in human-Valdrasani relations, though nobody involved realized it at the time. Back in the clearing, Beth was discovering that baby apex predators had energy levels that defied several laws of physics. The cubs had progressed from cautious investigation to full-scale play mode, which apparently involved using her as a combination jungle gym, pillow, and source of endless entertainment. "They're remarkably social," she noted, as 2 cubs engaged in what appeared to be a wrestling match over who got to investigate her sample containers. "Pack-bonding behavior is incredibly strong. They're including me in their play hierarchy without any apparent hesitation." One of the smaller cubs had climbed onto her lap and was now attempting to groom her hair with obvious confusion about human grooming requirements. Another had discovered that her equipment made interesting sounds when gently batted with oversized paws. "Motor skills are highly developed for their age," Beth continued. Coordination suggests rapid neurological development. Intelligence indicators are actually quite remarkable. What was remarkable was watching the cubs solve problems. When one of them wanted to reach her equipment pack but couldn't quite manage the height, two others immediately positioned themselves to create a stepping stone arrangement. When her water bottle rolled away from the group, 3 cubs coordinated a retrieval operation that would have impressed military strategists. They're not just intelligent, Beth realized. They're collaborative problem solvers. This level of social coordination in juveniles suggests adult pack intelligence that's probably been severely underestimated. From their concealed positions, the adult pack watched their offspring demonstrate cognitive abilities that even they found impressive. Cubs weren't supposed to be capable of complex cooperative behavior until much later in their development. But these cubs were organizing, planning, and executing group activities with the kind of sophistication usually reserved for experienced hunters. The human is teaching them, Kex observed. The human isn't doing anything, Six corrected. The cubs are learning from observation. They're studying her behavior and adapting their own responses accordingly. That's not normal cub behavior. It's advanced cub behavior. She's stimulating their development simply by being different. This was when Beth made her second crucial discovery. As the afternoon progressed, and the cubs grew more comfortable with their new playmate, they began exhibiting behaviors she had never seen documented in any research literature. They started teaching her their communication methods. It began simply enough. When she reached for her water bottle, 3 cubs immediately moved to help, but they accompanied the action with a specific series of chirps and body postures. When she tried to imitate the sounds, they repeated the sequence more slowly, clearly attempting to correct her pronunciation. "They're giving me language lessons," Beth said in amazement. Actual, intentional language instruction. This suggests cognitive development that's, well, it's almost human-like in its sophistication. The cubs seemed to find her attempts at their language hilarious, making sounds that could only be described as laughter when she mispronounced their vocal patterns. But they were patient teachers, repeating sequences until she managed acceptable approximations. As the sun began to set, painting the silver forest in shades of gold and amber, Beth faced a decision that would determine the success or failure of her entire research mission. The cubs had made it clear they expected her to stay. They had arranged themselves around her in what was obviously a protective sleeping formation, and their body language indicated they considered her a permanent addition to their pack structure. But somewhere in the forest, adult Valdrasani were watching, and while the cubs might have accepted her, the adults remained an unknown variable. Day 3 concluding, she recorded. Initial contact phase has exceeded all expectations. Cubs have demonstrated remarkable intelligence, social sophistication, and apparently genuine affection for human contact. However, adult pack response remains unknown. Recommend continued observation and gradual integration attempts. What she didn't know was that her situation was about to become significantly more complicated. As darkness fell over Valdris Prime, the adult pack made their decision. They emerged from the tree line in perfect formation, moving with the fluid grace that marked them as apex predators. 6 of the most dangerous creatures on the planet approached the clearing where their cubs had adopted a human as their new pack member. Beth's first instinct was pure, primal terror. These weren't the playful, adorable cubs she had been interacting with all day. These were killing machines designed by evolution to eliminate threats with maximum efficiency. Each adult stood nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder, possessed natural weapons that could shred armor plating, and moved with the kind of coordinated precision that made professional military units look amateur. But then, something extraordinary happened. The cubs, instead of fleeing to their parents for protection, positioned themselves between Beth and the adults. Not defensively, but proudly. They were presenting her to the pack, showing off their new family member. Alpha female 6 approached slowly, her amber eyes studying this unprecedented situation. Her cubs were obviously healthy, happy, and completely unafraid. The human had made no aggressive moves, showed no signs of predatory behavior, and had apparently spent the entire day serving as entertainment for the pack's offspring. "Well?" 6 seemed to say with a gesture that roughly translated to, "This is unexpected. If the cubs approve, we accept." What followed was the most surreal pack-bonding ceremony in galactic history. The adult Valdrasani, guided by their cubs' obvious enthusiasm, formally adopted Dr. Beth Hayes into their pack structure. She was assigned a position roughly equivalent to honorary aunt and mobile entertainment device, with special responsibilities for cub education and play supervision. Back aboard the Stellar Wanderer, Communications Officer Vera suddenly picked up a transmission from the planet's surface. "Captain," she called out in amazement, "we're receiving a signal from Dr. Hayes." "Life signs?" Captain Axel asked, rushing to the communications station. "Strong and stable. She's requesting extended research time." Extended research time? According to her transmission, she's been adopted by a Valdrasani pack. She wants to document their social structure from the inside. She's asking us to return in 6 months. The silence that followed was the kind reserved for witnessing either miracles or complete psychotic breaks. "She was adopted," Engineer Cato repeated slowly, "by apex predators, who have never not killed every visitor to their planet. That appears to be the situation, yes. And she wants to stay with them for 6 months. That's what she's requesting." First Officer Juno made a sound that might have been laughter or existential terror. "Well, I suppose this answers the question about human Valdrasani diplomatic relations." "How so?" "Apparently, the secret to peaceful contact with apex predators is to let their children adopt you as a pet." Over the following months, as Dr. Beth Hayes integrated fully into Valdrasani pack society, she made discoveries that revolutionized the scientific community's understanding of predator intelligence, social organization, and interspecies communication. Her research proved that many species classified as hostile were actually just protective, and that the key to peaceful contact often lay in understanding their family structures rather than their hunting behaviors. The cubs, meanwhile, continued to follow her everywhere, treating her as their favorite pack member and unofficial teacher. They learned human concepts like curiosity-driven exploration and scientific observation, while she learned Valdrasani pack coordination and environmental awareness. When the Stellar Wanderer returned 6 months later, they found Dr. Beth Hayes leading a pack of young Valdrasani in what appeared to be a nature walk, complete with impromptu lessons on local flora and fauna. She had become the galaxy's first interspecies pack educator, and the cubs had become the first non-human recipients of basic human educational methodology. But the transformations went even deeper than anyone had anticipated. The cubs had developed an insatiable curiosity about the wider galaxy, constantly asking questions about other worlds, other species, and the possibility of interstellar travel. Meanwhile, Beth had learned pack hunting techniques that made her more aware of her environment than any human in recorded history. "The remarkable thing," she explained to Captain Axel during her debriefing, "is how they've retained their natural predator instincts while developing what can only be described as scientific methodology. They observe, hypothesize, test theories, and adjust their understanding based on results. You taught apex predators how to be scientists. I taught cubs how to ask why instead of just what." The scientific methodology was apparently already there, just waiting for the right stimulus. The implications were staggering. 3 of the older cubs had begun documenting their own observations of local ecosystem changes, creating what amounted to the first non-human environmental research data. They had developed a primitive but effective system for categorizing plant species by nutritional value, seasonal availability, and potential medicinal properties. "They're not just learning," Beth continued with obvious pride. "They're innovating. Last month, they figured out how to use tool-making techniques to improve their den construction. They're teaching the adults." Elder 6 had approached the conversation with typical Valdrasani directness, communicating through the complex body language Beth had finally mastered. Her message was clear. The pack wanted to establish formal diplomatic relations with human colonies. "They want to send an ambassador," Beth translated. "Actually, 3 ambassadors. The oldest cubs want to study at human universities." "Apex predators want to attend college?" "Apparently, yes. They're particularly interested in xenobiology, environmental science, and what they call pack dynamics across star systems, essentially, comparative sociology. The crew of the Stellar Wanderer exchanged glances that conveyed their growing understanding that they had witnessed something unprecedented, the birth of the galaxy's first truly collaborative interspecies civilization. "So," Captain Axel said as they prepared for departure, "successful research mission?" "Beyond successful," Beth replied, watching her adopted pack play in the Silver Forest. "This has fundamentally changed our understanding of predator psychology and interspecies social dynamics." "And the adults? The ones who were supposed to eat you?" "Oh, they're wonderful, very protective, incredibly intelligent, and surprisingly good at collaborative problem-solving. It turns out that most of their aggressive behavior was actually defensive parenting. They're not hostile to visitors, they're just very committed to child safety. Child safety that involves creative dismemberment of trespassers." "Well, yes, but only if the trespassers behave threateningly. The key is approaching them as a potential pack member rather than an intruder." As they lifted off from Valdris Prime, leaving behind the first successful human Valdrisani cultural exchange program, the crew of the Stellar Wanderer reflected on the fundamental truth about humans. They didn't just solve problems, they adopted entire alien species as extended family. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the alien species adopted them right back. Especially if you had cubs who were convinced that humans made excellent babysitters.